Let's dive straight into the big global story. The ceasefire between Israel and Iran, announced by the US President Donald Trump, appears to be holding for now. Both countries have publicly committed to the truce, and both Tehran and Tel Aviv claiming victory after a 12-day war. US President Trump also doubled down his claim that recent US strikes had completely destroyed 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. This comes after an initial intelligence assessment by the Pentagon revealed that sites had not been destroyed and Iran's nuclear program has been set back only by a few months. Meanwhile, European and North American leaders have gathered at The Hague in Netherlands for the NATO summit. The alliance's members have endorsed increasing their defense budget to 5% of GDP. US President Donald Trump praised the defense spending plan earlier today. Speaking to reporters at the summit, the president also confirmed his commitment to the alliance's core collective defense promise, which he had initially undermined. To take this ahead, I'm now joined by Dana Stroul, Director of Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She's also the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. She has also authored a new article in Foreign Affairs magazine on how Iran could escalate the situation. Dana, thank you so much for being with us here on Global Lens. The current truce seems volatile and fragile for now. Do you think this is going to hold?
I think it remains to be seen, and certainly what's clear is for both Iran and for Israel, they needed a break. Iran needed a break from the constant Israeli strikes that were taking out their senior security leaders, their air defense, their missile launchers, vast parts of their nuclear program. And Israeli civilians needed a break from constantly having to run to their shelters because of Iranian ballistic missile attacks. So this gives both societies, both governments, a chance to take a time out. But what's really important now is what happens next. And I think for the sake of most of the Middle East and for the world, what everyone would like to see is a return to the negotiating table to deal with the ultimate disposition of Iran's nuclear program. And that is something we haven't seen many announcements about.
Right. What do you think in terms of the damage caused to the nuclear sites in Iran? We've been seeing all the intelligence reports that are appearing in US media. They're claiming that the strike has been limited in terms of the damage caused and perhaps has only been able to set back Iran's nuclear program by a few months. If that were true, would there be a possibility of further Israeli strikes on Iran?
So first of all, with respect to that intelligence report, it comes from only one of the 18 U.S. intelligence agencies that we have across the U.S. government. This was not coming from our Director of National Intelligence. And according to the reports about the report, it was made within the first 48 hours after the U.S. strikes, and it was with a low confidence assessment, which means we don't really know much and we need more days to really do a true battle damage assessment as to what happened. But it's also important, I think, to recognize that there was never going to be any series of airstrikes, either from Israel or from the United States, that were going to completely neutralize and eliminate Iran's nuclear program. Military action can delay, it can disrupt, but the Iranian regime does have the option of trying to rebuild, to recover things, and we also don't know the location of the enriched uranium stockpile. So given all of that, now there are a lot of decisions that the Iranian regime, is going to have to make, whether or not they actually want to pursue continuing to develop a nuclear weapon or actually assure the world that they only have peaceful intentions and make meaningful concessions on their nuclear program going forward. And if they're not willing to make those meaningful concessions, I do think that a return to military action is very possible.
What do you think is now going to happen over the next few weeks? At the NATO summit, the conversation was how to get back to the path of diplomacy, start negotiating on how you can put curbs on Iran's nuclear program. There was a JCPOA that Iran had walked back on in 2018. And now, in the face of humiliation, in the face of a war that has taken place, how do you get Iran to accept curbs? Why would they do that?
Well, one of the reasons they would do it is because all of the ways in which Iran was projecting power and destabilizing the Middle East at the time that the JCPOA in 2015 was negotiated has changed. It's a completely different security and strategic environment across the Middle East now, nearly 2 years after the October 7th, 2023 Hamas terror attacks. So, number one, the Iranian threat network, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Bashar al Assad in Syria, the militias in Iraq. It's a totally different structure, and those groups are not able to threaten the United States or Israel like they once were. Number two is Iran's vast ballistic missile arsenal cannot damage the Middle East the way we once thought they could. We've been able to effectively defeat and defend against Iran's ballistic missile and drone attacks. And number three, the political and diplomatic environment has changed. So I think a very important statement to look at is the G7 statement that came out of Canada just last week. In the middle of Israel's campaign inside Iran, the G7 still said Iran is the main driver of instability in the Middle East, and Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And so I think what President Trump is going to hear at the NATO summit is wanting to understand the game plan for following through on the other side of this military campaign and using diplomacy to really ensure that Iran does not retain pathways to a nuclear weapon.
Right. Dana, explain to us, before the strikes, and one of the reasons why Donald Trump said that this strike on Iran's nuclear facilities was necessary because they had been talking for 60 days. Iran was not listening. There was no deal reached, and that's why they struck those nuclear sites in Iran. Now, when they return to negotiations after the ceasefire, what will be the objectives of the U.S. government in terms of curbs? What kind of curbs will the United States, will Israel be pushing for?
Well, first of all, it's important to remind everybody of what President Trump's criticisms were of the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement from the Obama administration. The main concerns were one, that agreement had an expiration date on it. It only lasted for 10 years. And number two, that it conceded and allowed Iran to maintain domestic uranium enrichment within the country. And the belief and main criticism was that if Iran was allowed to maintain domestic enrichment, it always had a pathway to go for the nuclear weapon should the regime make the political decision to do that. And what was clear leading up to the Israeli military campaign is in those 5 rounds of negotiations led by Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is the Iranians were not budging on their insistence that they be able to retain domestic enrichment. And so now on the other side of the real serious degradation to their nuclear infrastructure after Israel and American strikes, the question is whether or not the regime is going to be ready to make concessions and negotiate on the insistence on retaining domestic enrichment.
Right. So you're saying that essentially U.S. would want a complete stop to further enrichment by Iran. They cannot have nuclear weapon grade fuel?
That is what President Trump has been saying, that all pathways to an Iranian nuclear weapon must be blocked. Now, before this military campaign, what the Trump administration appeared to have been negotiating was something very similar to the 2015 JCPOA. But now, given that they've directly challenged Iran and decimated so much of its nuclear and military industrial complex, it's hard to see how the Trump administration would just go back to the status quo ante in terms of negotiations. I think they're going to ask and expect the Iranian regime to go further.
Right. Dana, we also saw how Iran was hitting back at Israel. They carried out a limited strike on U.S. bases as well in Qatar, which had no real impact also. But the question that I would like to ask you further is that, and this is something that you've written about in the Foreign Affairs magazine as well, about how Iran could escalate. Do you think we would still have to watch out for how Iran could possibly try to attack Israel or cause damage to U.S. assets in the region?
Yes, the point of my piece was that when you think about how Iran might respond, the key questions are when, how, and how often. So what we've seen over the past couple years is actually an Iranian pattern or playbook for response. Usually there's something loud and big up front. We've seen the Iranians launch ballistic missiles now multiple times. Notably, the past three times when ballistic missiles have been used against US forces, they've actually found a way to telegraph their intent before so that US forces can be prepared to defend against those attacks. And that's what we saw in the case of Qatar just 24 hours ago. But the Iranian regime has a long memory, and probably this is not the end. So, Iran retains sleeper cells and assassination teams all over the world, far beyond the borders of the Middle East. They retain cyber capabilities, and they could, of course, they still have ballistic missiles and they still have drones, and they could attack the US bases and forces again. They could also choose to attack the energy infrastructure or other interests of their neighbors in the region. What I do think is important that we just saw is that the rest of Iran's threat network, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq, all decided to not intervene after the US struck Iran. So it looks like Iran is on its own, but certainly there are aspects of the Iranian security apparatus that are thinking through a much longer term response options that could inflict serious harm.
Right. So you feel that Iran continues to work for those long-term options to cause damage.
We've seen round one. Round one is not the end.
Round one is not the end. Thank you so much, Dana Stroul, for joining us for that very interesting conversation on the Israel-Iran war, the role of United States, negotiations on ending Iran's nuclear capabilities, and also how Iran could retaliate in the months and years to come. Thanks once again for being with us. Let's move on and get you more news from around the